Thank you. Thank you. Hey. Normally I always say thank you, both of you, but that doesn't apply here. My goodness. First of all, I want to thank you for sticking to your guns. I understand they tried to palm off Ken Ham on you instead of me. And you said, Dave or nothing, and that's good. Just don't let them... Just kidding, just kidding. Well, this is the organization I represent, Answers in Genesis. How many have been to the museum? I've talked to a few people. I'm sure if you just see who has been there, they would recommend a trip to Kentucky to see our museum. It is a 2-day affair if you're driving, 12 hours of driving, but the flight is a little faster, and you can get a direct flight from here right into Cincinnati, and once you're in Cincinnati at the airport, you're 5 miles from the museum, right on the interstate. So we hope to see you all out there. Well, I traveled about the country speaking a little bit. I retired in the year 2000 and started working on a part-time basis with Answers in Genesis, speaking all over the country. And then just a year ago, January 1st, I went full-time. So sold my house in St. Louis. I got $1.98 out of it. And of course, it had some acreage. And I bought a house in Kentucky, and so I'm a genuine Kentuckian. And I haven't learned how to speak Kentucky yet, but I'm working on it. Well, let's get into this talk. Everybody's interested in the origin of man. I mean, not too many people are interested in the origin of snails or cockroaches or moths or whatever. But when people talk about the origin of man, it draws some attention. And I think it's the whole idea of human evolution that probably sticks in the craw of Christians and creationists more than anything else. And I thought I would kind of get you in the mood for the talk this evening by showing you an exhibit that's been going on in London. It's called the Human Exhibit. You can go to the local zoo, the London Zoo, and there they have college students who've agreed to be the animals in the zoo. And so you go through and you can see them. You're not supposed to feed them, but you can... You can see them in the cage there, and people have really sort of been titillated by this. This zoo visitor said, it's hilarious. It turns everything upside down. It makes you think about humans in relation to the animals. Somebody else going through the zoo said, seeing people in a different environment among other animals teaches members of the public that the human is just another primate. Someone else going through said, a lot of people think humans are above other animals. When they see humans as animals here, it kind of reminds us we're not that special. Isn't that encouraging? I mean, you go to the zoo. Well, I put this talk together some years ago. It's called Lucy, She's No Lady. For starters, it's probably a male. And things kind of go down the hill from there. But we're going to have a critical examination of Australopithecus afarensis. Now you might wonder, why are we picking on this particular ape-man? Well, there are a lot of ape-men, as you know, or creatures believed to be ape-men, and I believe they can all be fairly easily, wherever there's enough evidence to look at, be distinguished as either human or ape. I don't believe God made any ape-men. But this is the one that's caught the public attention more than any other ape-man. And this is the one I think that really impresses scientists most. So if we can critically evaluate this specimen, or this general type of specimen, Australopithecus afarensis, we can use pretty much the same sort of a critique or approach to critically evaluate the other so-called hominid ancestors. Lucy's so important that she's actually left her home country and has moved for 6 years to the United States, where over the next 6 years she will be on display at 10 museums. And for $25 to $30 a pop, you too can go and venerate some ape bones. Right now, Lucy's at the Houston Museum of Natural History. She'll be there for quite a while. The exhibit is called Lucy's Legacy, The Hidden Treasures of Ethiopia, which is where the specimen was found. This is what it looks like. We have a replica of this in our museum in Kentucky. It's about a 40% complete skeleton of a creature very much like a pygmy chimp, although you don't want to say that around them. They get offended. But you might be interested in just getting on the internet and looking at the Houston Museum. You'll see they're making a lot of hoopla about this. This is one of the screens you see. With regard to Lucy, they ask, how do you relate? I would have thought a better question would be, do you relate? But no, how do you relate? Notice the question's loaded. Another question they raise is, her story is your story. So in other words, if you see Lucy, look into her, you're really looking into your own background and history. She is being accompanied, or he as the case may be, to our country by a representative from Ethiopia, from the National Museum there. I won't try to pronounce the name, I'll probably get it all wrong, but here she is. And she's apparently going to be over here during the time the specimen's in our country. And she obviously is very close to this specimen. She says, I have an emotional thing with her. I have trouble thinking of her as a fossil sometimes. I sometimes consider her as a human being that has life in her. Well, it takes a fair amount of imagination from a rather beat-up monkey skeleton that's 40% complete. But a lot of people have visited the exhibit so far, and they consider it, at least the ones that have blogs that I've read, well worth the money spent. Even a lot of atheists are having genuinely religious experiences, just contemplating the skeleton of this particular ape. For example, this gentleman has a blog site that I looked in on, and he said, I stood and stared at her. This is the Lucy specimen. I stood and stared at her for as long as my family would let me. Can't you just see the family? Come on, they're monkey bones, come on. I had butterflies in my stomach the whole time to look down at that little 3-foot, 8-inch skeleton, knowing how long ago she lived and how closely related we are to her. No words can do justice to the feeling you get. So he definitely got his $25 worth. The interesting thing is if you look around on the website for the Houston Museum, what about this? This is one thing I read there. For many years, Lucy was thought to be a direct human ancestor, but we now see her as belonging to a separate group of hominids from those which became our species, Homo sapiens. You get the picture here? Forget about it. She's not our direct ancestor. And yet, look what they say. Still, Lucy remains the benchmark. So she's not our ancestor, but she's the benchmark by which our ancestors are judged. Lucy remains the benchmark by which all other discoveries are judged. Lucy has become a household name known by scientists and non-scientists worldwide. She continues to inspire exploration of our ancient ancestors in order to discover more about the progress of mankind. So this is the reference standard. This is as good as it gets. I mean, we're going to look at the best shot that evolutionists have for human evolution, dealing with what is clearly not a human. It is definitely ape-like, but one that they believe is just a certainty, has something to do with man, although did not evolve directly into us. Well, a lot of teachers are taking their children to the Houston Museum, and during the 6 years that this specimen will be in our country, you can be sure that there will be millions of young children down into the early grades that will be taken in to contemplate these ape bones. For example, if you get on the Houston website, there's a whole section there for elementary school teachers. What should you emphasize? When the students come back from the museum, you know, what sort of in-class exercises should you do to hammer home the essential truth of our relatedness to Lucy? This gets a little technical. Some of you may not be able to follow it, but do your best. The teacher is told to ask the students, when and why did our ancestors start walking upright? Notice you are not to ask, did they start walking upright? Do we have ape-like ancestors? No. When and why? Then here it starts to get a little technical. Try to stay with me. We get into some math here. Put the students in groups of 2. Number each student 1 or 2. I told you it was going to get a little technical. Ask student number 1 to put his hands on the floor and walk on all 4 limbs around the classroom. Discuss with your partner, would you rather walk on 2 legs or 4? A related question would be, would you rather have a sharp stick in the eye or not? Why do you think apes began walking on 2 legs? Notice again, not did apes walk on 2 legs, but why did they? I mean, can you imagine the answers? Man, it was so hard in my back crawling on 4. It really felt good to get. That's it. It felt good. That's how they evolved. Here's the question. Is human evolution compatible with the Bible? No. Well, that's pretty much the end of my talk. We'll open for questions. Okay, expect a little bit more at today's flight expense. Okay, let's dig in a little further then. First, I want to establish the attitude of the evolutionary community on their confidence of the whole evolutionary paradigm. Notice I don't call evolution a theory. It's not. I have people come up to me all the time and say, I don't have to believe in evolution after all. It's only a theory. You know what I tell them? If evolution were a theory, you ought to consider believing in it. But it doesn't measure up. It's a paradigm. It represents the sum total that the contemporary scientist seems to be willing to consider. That is, there's only matter, energy, time, and space. There's nothing else. There's nothing supernatural. So we can look nowhere except the intrinsic properties of nature to account for our existence. And you see this in Julian Huxley. He's one of the Huxleys. Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog. They've been great defenders of evolutionism. And in his book, Evolution After Darwin, he said, in the evolutionary pattern of thought, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. So did all the animals and plants that inhabit it, including our human selves, our mind and our soul, as well as our brain and body, and so did religion. In fact, think about it. Talk about a Johnny-come-lately. 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, and religion finally gets invented by primitive man just in the last nanoseconds of this whole sweep on a relative scale. So far from religion or God explaining how the world came to be, evolution explains how God became contrived, invented in the minds of man. The Bible has a very different view on all of this. I know you're aware of that. 1 Corinthians 15:39 tells us that all flesh is not the same flesh. But there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of animals, another of fish, another of birds. In other words, these are different kinds of creatures. They're not interrelated. They are a different flesh altogether. In Psalm 100, one of my favorite psalms, we read, "Know that the Lord, He is God. It is He who has made us, and not we ourselves." This is pretty much it right here. It is God who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And then Jesus Himself reveals His approach to creation, and particularly that of man. When asked about divorce, He responded and said, "Have you not read?" I love that. He just says, "Don't you folks read your Bibles?" That was basically the response. "Have you not read that He," and that would have been the Old Testament, right, that they would have read because the New Testament was available yet. "Have you not read that He who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." From the beginning, not the Big Bang, creation of man and woman from the beginning. And this is the whole basis of marriage. Well, people sometimes argue that Darwin never said we evolved from monkeys. In fact, back during the Scopes trial, the defense of teacher John Scopes tried to argue that Darwin never claimed man evolved from monkeys. In fact, even today, if you say that, evolutionists get very upset. Even if you say that they evolved from apes, they want you to say ape-like creatures, and certainly not monkeys. Apes are basically tailless monkeys. But if you look at Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, written a few years after Origin of Species, He said that the Simiidae then branched off into two great stems, the New World and the Old World monkeys. That would be M-O-N-K-E-Y-S, for those of you sitting way back. That would be monkeys. And from the latter, that would be monkeys, at a remote period, man, the wonder and glory of the universe, proceeded from the monkeys. Yeah. Now, a fellow that was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who was writing and doing his work right about the time of the publication of Origin of Species. In fact, this drawing was made between the Origin of Species and Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, in 1867. Some of you may have heard of Ernst Haeckel. He's widely considered to have been essentially a charlatan, not a real scientist, but he did much to popularize evolution. In fact, this is one of the first attempts to deal with the so-called specifics of evolution, starting with a single cell, going through all these stages on up to this gentleman here. I got this out of a biology textbook, and I couldn't believe what they said about this drawing by Haeckel, who, by the way, if you're familiar with his work on recapitulation, he actually falsified the data, used the same woodcut more than once to show how similar pigs and humans are and what have you as an embryo. In the book, look what they say. This is a biology textbook. Although this genealogical chart, starting with a blob of protoplasm up here, and continuing to a modern Papua, that's the gentleman down here, although this is filled with misconceptions and fictitious creatures, it's fairly accurate. Am I missing something here? I mean, apparently it didn't go by you either. I mean, fairly accurate, let's give him his due, fairly accurate considering the dearth of knowledge in his day. In other words, how little we knew then. And of course, things have not changed greatly to this day, as you will see. There are really four primary assumptions, starting assumptions, that impact on our interpretation of the fossil record as it relates to the origin of man. First, all origins must be explained in strictly naturalistic terms. That is, in terms of human evolution, one must not in any way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, bring in a supernatural event, a god, etc. So we must confine all explanations to strictly naturalistic terms. And this isn't just simply a rule of the game. Another part of this is we must exclude the possibility of anything ever being non-naturalistic. So it's not like we're just limiting our own explanations, but there can be no other explanation. Here's the second little rule. Similarity proves evolutionary ancestry. That there can't be any other basis for similarity, which we sometimes call homology, than that we share a common evolutionary ancestor. The third axiom is that man has evolved from ape-like ancestors. This is not a point that's debated or questioned by evolutionists. And finally, at least some ape-like fossils that we find as we dig around must be our ancestors. Why? Because, well, as one evolutionist said, if they're not, we wouldn't have any ancestors. So at least some of the fossils we dig up just have to be our evolutionary ancestors. But not all evolutionists are equally confident about our results thus far. Richard Lewontin is a professor at Harvard University. He's a self-professed atheist and Marxist and certainly an evolutionist. He said, and I quote, in Human Diversity, he said, despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. And you know, when you look at the tables, you certainly get that impression. Here's a typical diagram of human evolution starting with insectivores down here. And notice all the question marks in there. At every branch you see question marks, or they ought to be there if not shown, because most of these charts do show dotted lines and question marks, indicating that these are speculations. And if we take this last step from an Australopithecine to man, it's supposed to have occurred over the last 5 million years, give or take a week or two, one way or another. Here is the common ancestor of modern apes and modern man. Now, sometimes you'll hear creationists say, If man evolved from apes, how come we still have apes? That's really not a good point to make, because evolutionists would point out that African apes didn't evolve into man, so you wouldn't expect their numbers to be diminished because man is evolving. That rather modern apes and modern humans share a common ancestor 5 million years ago, and of course that common ancestor is a much debated point. I haven't even chosen to take a stab here. These dotted lines are fairly typical of what you see in these charts, and they oftentimes include the question marks. In case you don't realize, dotted lines means conjecture or speculation. So what we can see is if you were to take that all away, it just simply means this organism lived from here to here virtually unchanged. This one lived from here to here unchanged, here to here unchanged. One thing I find interesting in these diagrams is notice the ancestors leading up to man. Now notice the ancestors from our common ancestor leading up to African apes. It's as though we've told the African apes, if you're interested in your evolution, figure it out for yourself. We're working on humans. Now, all of the creatures you see here are Australopithecines. That's what the A stands for. And Australopithecus is a word that simply means, take it apart, Australo means, like in Australian, it means south. My friend Ken Ham from Australia says he's from the deep south. And Pithecus, wherever you see the word Pithecus, Pithecus means ape. So if any creature has Pithecus in the name, whatever else we can say about it, it is an ape. So these are all Australopithecines indicated here up until you get to Homo. This is Ramitis and Anamensis and Afarensis and Africanus used to be an ancestor of ours, but notice it's been put off in a side shoot. We call this a collateral relative. Didn't quite make it to man, made it part way and got into a side shoot or a dead end and didn't go any further. So a hominid is really any primate that is a known ancestor of man or a collateral relative, which means there would be no hominids, except perhaps man himself. Now we're going to be looking at this one right here. This is Australopithecus afarensis. This is Lucy. Lucy's the common name. Admitted, it's easier to say Lucy than Australopithecus afarensis. So oftentimes people will just use the word Lucy when they mean this whole species. Well, before we dig in any further, let's look at some sobering comments made by evolutionists. These are definitely not creationists we're talking about here. This gentleman said, even with DNA sequence data, we have no direct access to the process of evolution. So objective reconstruction of the vanished past can be only achieved by what? Creative imagination. You got it. Maybe he's the only one that feels that way, huh? Well, this gentleman writing in Time magazine, of course they spend a great deal of time pointing out our evolution. This article, How Man Began, in 1994. Different author, similar conclusion. The only certainty in this data-poor, imagination-rich, endlessly fascinating field is that there are plenty of surprises left to come. Yeah, that kind of data will lead to a lot of surprises. Several years ago, I was at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. They actually had a multi-million-dollar evolution exhibit, all based on like a carnival theme. They had these, you know, like the two-headed cow, you pay an extra quarter to see the bearded lady, whatever. And the paintings are always more impressive than the real thing. You remember that from the carnival posters? This is the kind of stuff they actually had at the Field Museum of Natural History. Look at this thing. Nobody believes. No evolutionist believes this. This is just a ludicrous caricature, and yet the sign says, human ancestor, question mark? Up above, the missing link, question mark? Mammal-like rept. What on earth is this supposed to convey to visitors to the museum? Well, Science 81, magazine that is no longer in publication because the year 82 rolled around, kind of killed it, but anyway. Said, in the view of many paleoanthropologists, those are the people that study fossils of human ancestry, in the view of many paleoanthropologists, the story, and there's your right word for it, never mind theory, the story of human evolution has been fictionalized to suit needs other than scientific rigor. My sentiments exactly. Now, let's just look at what they do. The first thing you do to convince the public that we have an evolutionary ancestor or that birds are evolved from reptiles or whatever, the first thing you do is hire an artist. And if the artist wishes to be paid, he or she will paint what they're told to paint. And this is back when Australopithecus africanus was sort of thought to be one of our human ancestors. This is clearly an ape, no longer considered to be ancestral. But let me tell you what grinds me. There's certain things in life that really irritate me. One are paintings of ape-like ancestors of man. I mean, I go through life with a posture like this, and every one of these ape men look like a Marine drill sergeant. And look at these hands. Absolutely human hands. We know for a fact these Australopithecines didn't have hands like that. I mean, that's an absolute fact, and yet look at the hands. And tools. And the contemplative gaze. It's interesting. The author said, I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where it was headed. So the artist can convey whatever it is they wish to convey. You'll certainly see that when we look at our exhibit in St. Louis. That exhibit is based on Lucy. And this is Lucy here. Okay, you guys, there'll be no whistling. It's a 40% complete primate. That's a lot of bones for a primate. Normally you're lucky to find just a piece of mandible or some teeth or whatever. By the way, did you hear about the evolutionist that found a small fragment of molar and immediately determined that it was a human ancestor, an ape-like ancestor of man, and he really got excited. He said, wow, I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't believed it. So Donald Johanson is attributed as discovering this fossil. Actually, there were several other people, Morris Taib and others that were with him. We usually blow them off and just think of Johanson. And he found it in Ethiopia back in 1974. And this is the specimen that is in Houston today and will be traveling all around the United States. This ape is dated at 3 million years old, but I want you to recall one thing about Lucy. She's been dated more than any cheerleader you know. I mean, they have had all kinds of dates. She's been as young as 2 million years old. In fact, originally they had it a couple of million years old, and then Richard Leakey found KMNER 1470 that was very human-like, and it was older. And if you read this book, Lucy, The Beginnings of Humankind by Johanson and Eddy, published in 1981, they actually tell you that they had to throw out the radiometric dating because it didn't make any sense. And they went to a guy named Basil Cook, who studies pig teeth. I know you're wondering what does pig teeth have to do with determining how old Lucy is and what have you. Basil Cook's pigs, he said, are evolving over the same 5 million years that man is evolving. And by looking at what pig teeth he finds in what strata, and he knows exactly the time scale for the evolution of these pigs, by finding appropriate pig teeth, he can tell you how old your ape fossils are, whatever you find in what is believed to be similar strata. We sometimes call this kind of thing an index fossil. The thing that's amazing about Basil Cook is you tell him up front what you'd like, and he generally finds it's quite possible when he contemplates the pig teeth. But this is a remarkably complete skeleton, and notice we have bones just on one side, the femur from the left, the innominate or hip bone from the left, but it's quite possible to make a mirror image, you know, specimen and put it on the right. So if you have the left, you have the right as far as just studying function and shape. This is what the skull of Australopithecus afarensis looks like. This skull is primitive by ape standards. There's nothing about this skull that would literally shout, I'm about to turn into a human. A very sloping, shovel-like face. Another distinctive feature of apes is you can't see into the orbits from the side. Notice this bone comes right up. You sort of know there's an orbit back there, but you have to get around the front to see it. The human orbit is cut back quite far. There are no apes that have ever been discovered that have a cut back orbit on the side. No apes that have a completely flat face like man, top to bottom here. Small cranial capacity, in fact, small by ape standards. This is what you call your basic ape. But the rest of the body is believed to be quite human-like. This is the exhibit in the St. Louis Zoo, and this is an amazing exhibit. It's very lifelike. It's a